Okay, so hello everyone. Today we're delighted to welcome Dr. Veronique Ouellet, who holds a Bachelor of Science in Agronomy and a Master's of Science in Animal Sciences from Laval University. To perfect her knowledge, she completed a research fellowship at the Freie University in Berlin under Dr. Wolfgang Hieser's supervision. She then completed a PhD in animal sciences at Laval University, aiming at investigating the effects of heat stress in dairy herds of the province of Quebec. During her doctorate studies, she interned for Dr. Victor Cabrera at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Subsequently, she completed a postdoctoral fellowship in lactation physiology and epigenetics at the University of Florida under Drs. Jimena Laporta and Jeff Dahl, before obtaining a professor position in the Department of Animal Sciences at Laval University in September 2020. Dr. Ouellet's current research focuses on the interaction between the animal and its pre- and postnatal thermal environment. Her fields of expertise include lactation and stress physiology, as well as dairy cattle management and nutrition. Her work has made it possible to demystify the effects of heat stress in continental climates, to better understand the impacts of heat stress during the dry period, and to establish heat tolerance thresholds in dairy cows and calves. Through her research, collaborations, involvements in the agricultural community, and extension activities, Dr. Ouellet ultimately wishes to optimize the resilience of livestock to climate change through an applied and collaborative approach. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Veronique, to begin. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Colin, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again so much, Colin and Ivan, for inviting me to talk about my past and future research, which mainly, like you just saw, focuses on the resilience of the dairy sector to climate change, and more specifically on the effects of heat stress in continental climate, which is the climate that characterizes most of the agricultural territory of the province of Quebec, but of Ontario as well. So today, since it is a Friday afternoon and all, I wanted to keep it fairly simple. I am first going to talk to you about heat balance and heat transfer to the environment, because I feel like this is basic knowledge that you need to acquire in order to understand heat stress. Then we're going to move on to the heat stress related physiological responses and its consequences on the dairy cows. And lastly, we're going to talk about thermal tolerance and how we can improve it in the future in our Canadian herds. So first, you need to know that a dairy cow produces a lot of heat. It produces heat, for instance, via growth, maintenance, digestion, gestation, lactation. So this means also that a cow that produces a lot of milk will also produce a lot of heat. And in a warm climate, this heat will have to be dissipated into the environment. And why that is, you might ask, is because maintaining an equilibrium, like you see on the slides, between heat gains and heat losses to the environment is necessary for the cow to achieve its optimal performance. To maintain this neutral balance that we just talked about, the cow is going to have to dissipate heat in the environment via 4 mechanisms. So we have 3 of those mechanisms, namely conduction, radiation, and convection, that rely on a temperature gradient. So this means that if we have a high ambient temperature, the heat dissipation through those mechanisms will decrease. Fortunately for the cow, it can also lose heat in the environment via evaporation, namely by sweating and by panting, so by an acceleration in the respiration rate, if you want to put it that way. And those evaporative mechanisms, they rely on a humidity gradient, meaning that this will be very efficient under a dry climate, and we will lose some of this dissipation when we have a high relative humidity. So heat dissipation to the environment will decrease under high ambient temperature coupled with a high relative humidity. This will skew the heat balance of the animal that we just talked about, and it will lead to an increase of body core temperature. This increase in body core temperature will make the cow to enter a state of heat stress, and this heat stress, the condition that we're going to talk about today, will trigger a series of adaptations in the animal. And those adaptations, they all aim to promote heat loss in the environment, but also to reduce the inner heat load of the animal. So first, whether heat stress occurs during lactation, the dry period, or when the animal is a calf, what we're going to notice as an adaptation is a decrease of dry matter intake. This is done mainly to reduce the inner heat load of the animal. And we're also going to notice some increases in respiration and heart rate to help the animal dissipate more heat to the environment. We're also going to notice some changes in the behavior of the animal. So if we look at the lactating cows under heat stress or dry cows, we're going to notice some decreases in rumination time and lying time. This is not something that we want in our herds because those two parameters are highly correlated with milk yield. Obviously, we're also going to notice an increase in standing time because the animal is going to try to dissipate more heat to the environment. And we're also going to notice an increase in water intake. So it is very important to have water available at all times for the animal, especially during summer months. In an effort to dissipate more heat to the environment, we're also going to notice under heat stress that there is an increase in the peripheral blood circulation. This basically means that there's going to be more blood that is going to be brought to the skin environment interface. As a consequence, there will be less nutrients and oxygen that's going to be supplied to the deep organs. And when I mention deep organs, I'm thinking about especially the gut and the uterus. So if we focus on the uterus, this will also mean that there's going to be less nutrients and oxygen supplied to the developing fetus. And we're going to see that this is going to have some severe consequences on the fetus, in my next slides. But now if we focus on the gut, and you need to know that the integrity of the intestinal barrier depends on the constant supply of nutrients and oxygen. So under heat stress, the integrity of the intestinal barrier is going to be compromised, like you can see on the screen. And this means that some intestinal content, namely, for example, the LPS, which is a compound of the surface on some bacteria, is going to be able to move into the bloodstream. This will in turn activate an inflammatory reaction and activate the immune system. And the immune system needs a lot of glucose in order to work. So it will take away the glucose that would be available normally to the animal to other functions, just like, for example, milk production. Something else that we're going to notice in cows that are suffering from heat stress, and especially in lactating cows suffering from heat stress, is an increase in insulin and prolactin. And that increase in prolactin is also observed in dry cows suffering from heat stress. The increase in insulin is quite peculiar during heat stress because we need to remember that our animals are consuming less feed. So this increase will also add a lot of impacts on the metabolism of the cow, namely because it will prevent the animal to mobilize fat and to use that fat as an energy source. So again, the glucose will have to serve as the main source of energy for the animal. So if we sum up a little bit what we just talked about, an heat stressed dairy cow will have higher energy requirements because the animal has to spend some energy to dissipate heat to the environment, and it will also need more energy to activate the immune system. Also, we are in a condition where the energy is less available because the animal is not able to mobilize its fat as an energy source, and also because the animal is consuming less feed. So you'll understand that this situation is not ideal for the performance of the animal. So when we look at the literature, heat stress is often mentioned to be negatively associated with milk yield, and we can expect a reduction of about 40%. But we need to keep in mind that most of the heat stress studies were conducted in a tropical climate or arid climate, or in climatic chambers mimicking harsh climate conditions. So therefore, those animals are probably exposed to severe heat stress during a lot of time during the year. So therefore, during my PhD, I was curious to know if heat stress would also affect the milk yield in the herds of Quebec. So what I did to answer my question is that I worked with over 600,000 test day records of about 35,000 Holstein dairy cows that were all raised in the province of Quebec City. I separated my records into 5 heat stress exposure categories. So I'm going to go over those categories with you so that you understand the graph that I'm trying to show you. So first, I had a no heat stress category. So meaning that the cow was not exposed to any heat stress causing days before its milk record. So this is in blue. And then in yellow, I had a category of heat stress of 1 to 2 consecutive days with heat stress before test day. And it is important to note that the calculation of consecutive days with heat stress started before test day, because the weather condition on the test day does not impact the performance of the animal. And then in orange, I had a category of 3 to 4 days with heat stress. And then in red, I had 5 to 6. And in burgundy, I have the most severe heat stress exposure category with 7 to 8 consecutive days with heat stress before the milk record. So interestingly enough, what we concluded in that study is that milk yield of the herds that were included in the data set was not associated with heat stress exposure. And this was true for the first lactation cows, but it was also the case for the second and third lactation cows. And this is quite surprising if we consider what I just told you about milk yield and heat stress in the literature. But we hypothesize that this is probably related to the severity of the heat stress in our herds. So I'm pretty sure that you know that herds in Quebec City are not exposed to severe heat stress condition often during the year. Then we use the same data set and the same methodology to assess the association between heat stress, but this time with milk fat. And what we observed is that milk fat was negatively associated with heat stress, with a maximum decrease of about 20 grams per day for the third lactation cow. And I want you also to point your attention to the fact that 1 or 2, so the yellow category, 1 or 2 days with heat stress were enough to provoke a decrease in milk yield, in milk fat, sorry. So this means probably that milk fat is more sensitive to heat stress than milk yield. And this is something that we also see in the literature. So also what we did the same kind of work, but this time with milk proteins. I won't go too much into depth into those results because they're closely related to what we just saw with milk fat. So we could see that milk proteins were negatively associated with heat stress, but this time it took more days with heat stress to be able to provoke a decrease in milk proteins. So now let's move on to a totally different situation. So when heat stress occurs during the dry period, and what I mean about the dry period, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but I mean the 60 days before a calving. And during the dry period, it is important also to note that the cow is in a non-lactating state. So when we look at studies that compare the milk yield of dry cows that were exposed to heat stress or dry cows that were not exposed to heat stress so that they were cooled, what we see is a decrease in their subsequent milk performance. So when we look at studies, we can see an average decrease of about 3.5 kilograms per day in cows that suffered from heat stress during the dry period. Also, I want to point your attention, though, that all of those studies were conducted in a tropical climate or arid climate, with most of the studies conducted at the University of Florida. About dry cows, what is really also interesting is that we don't see the increase in insulin that I told you about in the lactating cows. But what we notice are increases in prolactin and estrogen. What you need to know is that prolactin can trigger apoptosis in mammary cell. So probably that this increase in prolactin coupled with a decrease in estrogen can blunt the mammary involution and lead to detrimental effect on the milk performance during the subsequent lactation. So if we go back to this figure, when we said that heat stress will create a situation that is not too ideal for the performance of the animal, I want to add that also heat stress is going to deeply change and affect the maternal circumstances of the cow, because it will provoke an increase in core body temperature. And like I mentioned, it will also increase the peripheral blood circulation. So it will divert the blood away from the uterus and from the fetus. And this is really important to consider because the dairy cow is in gestation during most of her production cycle. And if we take a look at an equation that I'm sure that you guys are familiar with, well, we know that the phenotype will depend on the genotype of the animal and the environment. And this environment is not only related to the postnatal life of the animal, but it can also be related to its prenatal life. So therefore, we need to understand that the prenatal environment in the animal could potentially have an impact on its phenotype during its life. So to test that hypothesis, I researched studies that compare birth weight of daughters that were either born to cows that were exposed to heat stress during their dry period or to cows that were not exposed to heat stress during their dry period, so because they were cooled. And I want you to know that I focus mainly on the dry period because it also coincides with late gestation, which is a very important period for the fetus because it will acquire about 60% of its birth weight during that time. So if we look at those studies, we can see that often the daughters that are born to heat stress dams will be lighter at birth compared to other daughters that were not born to heat stress dam, and we can see an average decrease of about 4.2 kilograms. Interestingly enough, some studies follow their animal until weaning, and we can see that this difference in weight will also last until weaning, with the daughters that are born to animals that were heat stressed during the dry period will be approximately 6.3 kilograms lighter compared to daughters that were not born to heat stress dam. However, what I want to mention also is that in the studies that I just mentioned, I also noticed that heat exposure during the dry period is associated with a reduction in gestation length of about 2.5 days. So maybe that, of course, this reduction in gestation length could also contribute to the lighter birth weight that we just discussed. However, if we do some quick math and we consider that an Holstein fetus will acquire about 0.5 kilograms per day during the last weeks of gestation, then this reduction in gestation length can only explain about 35% of the reduction of the birth weight. So the remainder of this reduction is probably explained by other factors, such as the diversion of the blood flow to the periphery, and also because probably of the reduction in the dry matter, and probably also because of the effect of the heat itself. So during my postdoc, we were interested in the effects of the maternal heat stress on the performance of the progeny. So what we did is that we pulled and analyzed records of daughters, again, that were either born to dams that were heat stressed and daughters that were born to them that were cool during the dry period. And we used studies conducted over a period of 10 years, and they were all conducted at the University of Florida. What we did also is that we tracked their performance until the third lactation. And I want to point out it is very important for you to understand that the animals that we use were only heat stress in utero. So during their postnatal life, they were always cooled. So technically, they were not exposed to heat stress. So first, what we did is that we compared the longevity of the daughters that were born to heat stress dam to the daughters that were not born to heat stress dam. And what we noticed is that the lifespan of the animals, so what I mean by that is the time that is elapsed between birth and the moment that the animal left the herd, was reduced by about 12 months in the animals that were born to heat stress dam. In addition, we saw no difference in the probability of the animal to reach first breeding, but we saw that there were a tendency towards a reduction of animals that would reach first calving. Also, we saw that there were more animals that entered the lactation string in the group that were born from the heat stress dams. And also we saw a overall longevity, productive life reduction in the animals that were born from heat stress dams. And that reduction was about 5 months. And what I mean by productive life is the time elapsed between the first calving and when the animal left the herd. So then what we did is that we compared the milk production of those animals, and we focused on milk yield because in the United States, the producers are not being paid upon the composition of the milk, but they are paid on the quantity of milk that they're going to deliver. So here what we have is in blue, we have the milk yield of the animals that were born to cool dams. And then in red, we have the milk yield of animals that were born to heat stress dams. And I think that it is really noticeable that the animals that were born to heat stress dam produce less milk during their first, second, and third lactation. So to better understand the effects of this in utero heat stress on postnatal phenotypes, Dr. Jimena Laporte lab, in which I did my postdoc fellowship, recently conducted a trial where we euthanized daughters, of dams that were either heat stress or cool during their dry period. And we did that to be able to harvest some tissue and organs of interest during different stages of the life of the animal. So namely at birth, at weaning, and when the animal reached 1 year old. I feel like today I don't have time to present those results to you, but I just wanted to point out that there's a paper that was recently published about those results. And it can be found on my ResearchGate page, which I will give you the address on my last slide. So far we have seen that heat stress has consequences on the dairy cow throughout the life cycle. Recently, for my research, I became really interested in knowing when cows become heat stressed and the factors that can influence the thermotolerance of the dairy cows. So in heat stress studies, heat stress is often assessed by an environmental indicator of heat stress, which is called the temperature humidity index, like you see here, or simply the THI. And you'll understand that for the rest of my presentation, I'm going to use the acronym THI. So THI is unitless, and as you can see, can be easily calculated following an equation because it only requires the ambient temperature and the relative humidity. And those data are easily available as they can be measured on farm by loggers, or they can be measured at local weather station. But those data have to be adapted in order to be more representative of the condition on farm. Also, it is important to know that THI can be calculated via several equations, but what I put today on my slide is the one that is most widely used in the research literature. So in previous heat stress studies, so before the year 2008, a THI threshold, so a THI value of 672 was associated with a decline in milk yield in dairy cows. And this threshold was retrieved from a study that was conducted in the United States. In 2008, this threshold was scaled down a little bit, and it was scaled down to a value of 68. And that value of 68 has been widely used in the past years as a threshold for heat stress, so because it is associated with a decline in milk yield. However, I want to bring your attention to the fact that this THI threshold was only demonstrated in Holstein dairy cows that produce about 35 kilograms per day and that were reared in a arid climate. So that study was conducted in Arizona, so a climate that is more dry than ours. When we look at heat stress studies that were conducted in a continental climate, so where cows are not exposed to as severe and harsh heat stress condition, what we notice is that the THI threshold that is associated with heat stress is lower than what we saw in the previous slide. So we have THI ranging from 60 to 65 that could be detrimental for the performance of the animal. So it seems that the climate where the animal is raised can influence its thermotolerance. So besides climate, it is also logical to think that thermotolerance of the animal could be associated with its physiological state. Until now, the THI threshold of 68 that I just told you about was widely used also on dry cows. However, like I mentioned, the dry cow is in a non-lactating state, so therefore it probably generates less heat compared to a lactating cow because of lactation. So recently what I did is that I used a broken line regression approach to try to find a THI threshold in dairy cows. However, like we saw in lactating cows, I could not use milk production as a point of reference for heat stress. I instead used rectal temperature and respiration rate. And what I noticed is that above a THI of 72, the dry cow is not able to maintain a constant rectal temperature. And past that point, I observed a significant increase of rectal temperature that could be associated with heat stress. On my slide here on my graph, you can also see, well, you can see the red line that I just told you about, but there's also a blue line. And that blue line represented dry cow that had access to a cooling system. So in those animals, I was not able to detect a significant breakpoint in my data set, which is not surprising. Now, if we look at the respiration rate of the animal, again, for the dry cow that were exposed to heat stress, I was able to detect a breakpoint of 77, above which the respiration rate of the animal started to increase significantly. This is a little bit counterintuitive, but for the animals that had access to a cooling system, I found a lower breakpoint of 75. This is quite strange, but I want to point your attention to the fact that the respiration rate of this animal was fairly low throughout the experiment, meaning that they were probably not suffering from heat stress. One of my colleagues and I recently, we did the same kind of work, but this time with dairy calves. There's not lots of research about dairy calves and heat stress because those animals are believed to be more thermal tolerant because they're not in lactation. But we were also able to detect significant breakpoints in dairy calves. So for rectal temperature, respiration rate, and milk replacer intake. But I want you to understand that these THI breakpoints don't necessarily mean that the animal are suffering from heat stress. It only means here that the animal will start to thermoregulate differently at the THI that is detected by the model. So now what's next? When Colin invited me to present today, he mentioned that he wanted me to talk about my future research, and that's what I'm going to do in my next slides. So what I want to do next is first, I want to conduct a reevaluation of THI threshold in Canadian herds. THI might not be the best way to assess heat stress in cows, but it is very practical on a research standpoint, and it can also help us to quantify the consequences of heat stress in our herds. It's also very useful to be able to calculate cooling requirements of our animal. What I want to do also in the next year is to determine some animal-based indicators of heat stress. So we just talked about environmental indicators, so indicators that are based on the environment of the animal, but I want to work at the animal level to be able to detect animal-based indicators such as rectal temperature or respiration rate that is associated to heat stress. Also, what I need to work on also, like I mentioned, I want to work at the animal level, and I want to work to detect some heat stress biomarkers for better heat tolerance. And I put down here on the slide fatty acids because fatty acids profiled in the milk will change under heat stress. And we have here a great opportunity to use that information to be able to select for more heat tolerant animals. Also with the work that we can conduct with Lactanet, that could be a good collaboration to try to investigate this further. And finally, the main goal would be to identify genes of thermotolerance at the animal level. However, this is more easily said than done, and this will require, of course, further research. So the take-home messages for today, what I want you to remember about my presentation is first that heat stress has consequences in herds that are raised in a continental climate. It is not limited to herds that are raised in a subtropical or arid climate, but maybe those consequences are not the same depending on the climate. Also, there are several factors that can influence the thermotolerance of an animal. We talked about the climate where the animal is raised. We also talked about the physiological state of the animal. And of course, there is also an individual response of the animal to heat stress, which also indicate that there is probably an interaction between the genotype and the environment. And finally, there is a need to find strategies to minimize the impact of heat stress. So those strategies can be to work on the environment of the animal. It can also include to work on the nutrition of the animal to help the animal to promote more heat into the environment. And it can also imply some genetics also to maybe add some gene of thermotolerance in our future breeding programs. And this is particularly important to do so considering that we are in a context of climate change. So the consequences of heat stress can potentially increase in the future if no strategies are implemented on our farms. So with that, merci, thank you, and I will take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Dr. Ouellet, for the great presentation. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to throw up your hands or to type them into the chat box and I can read them out. So we have a question from Christopher Powell, and he says, have you looked at rate of change of THI on milk yield, etc.? For example, going from 55 to 65 over a day versus over a week?
A very good point. In the data set that we have, we couldn't do so, but this is something that is very important because heat stress in a continental climate is not as severe like we saw that in a tropical climate, but we have huge THI variation within days and also within weeks during the summer. So this is something that would be very important to look at. So to determine whether the animal is more impacted by a punctual THI or by a THI variation.
Thank you. We have another question then from Murillo, who says, thanks for the great presentation. Clearly, heat stress has a very relevant negative economical impact, and selecting animals that are more thermotolerant is an alternative to minimizing it. However, by doing that, aren't we going to select animals that are more susceptible to cold stress? There are studies showing negative effects of low temperatures for newborn and young animals, and a very large amount of calves and heifers are raised outdoors in Canada.
Great comment again. Yes, I understand. I understand where you're coming from. Yeah, so that's why a little bit why I said that selecting for thermotolerance is easier said than done, because there are a lot of things to consider, and cold stress is to consider. But we need to remind, I think, that dairy cows produces a lot of heat, so therefore it is less sensitive to cold stress. But this is something, of course, to have in mind, not to have animals that will be less tolerant to cold stress. But I feel like I don't have a clear answer to the question that was just asked, but this is something to consider.
Great. Flavio, do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. So hi, Veronique. Thanks for the presentation. I have a question for you. I don't know if you are aware that we did some work on the same area of research. And so there are two theses on this, and basically trying to determine this thresholds for production rates and so much service score. Initially in two provinces, the main ones, like Ontario and Quebec, but also we did for the whole entire Canada. So I just to make sure that you are aware, because I think we could collaborate more, because we have plans, and probably Ivan is going to talk after me. We have plans that kind of overlap what we are thinking to do. So maybe it would be a great opportunity to collaborate and discuss more, so that we do more, not just overlapping, right? And one thing that's I think you didn't mention in your presentation, that we can also use other source of weather data, that is the NASA power, that we investigate, and then we show that we can really use and replace the weather station data by the NASA power, that would allow us to look at more herds, right? To cover the entire herds in Canada, in fact. So yeah, it was just a comment to make sure that you are aware that you are working on this. And I don't have a specific question, but I think probably Ivan that like to ask a question.
If I can just bounce back on your comments, of course we need to collaborate more, and that is very important to me also, and that's also why I'm here. I feel like it's important to talk about our result and not overlap, like you mentioned. And yes, I totally agree that using NASA Power data station is quite neat in research, because we can build those huge data set. But I think that we can also refine the use of those of this data by also studying the effects of, for example, having a great ventilation within barn, and how we can impact, and how we can try to eliminate this difference between the outside of the farm and the inside. But yeah, I agree that we can totally use this data.
Yeah, what we did, if you look at the thesis and the paper that's published by Ivan, we look at the average impact, right? We didn't discriminate because we didn't have the information about the control. that could exist in the barn, right?
Yeah.
What Ivan did was he removed outliers that clearly would have a kind of and we check on this, but that clearly they have a sophisticated control of the environment of the barn. So, but if in general we are finding this effects, imagine if you go to those herds that don't have a good system to grow, how would be the impact, right? And for selection's sake, for selection of bulls, the average effect is okay, because that bull is going to produce in all different environments, right? So, but that's an interesting question, and we are trying to obtain more details of the herds to be able to model, right? So, but I'll pass to Ivan. I think he likes to ask direct question to you. Thanks, Veronique.
Thank you. We'll be in touch.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Do so.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Ouellet. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay. Yeah, I guess Flavio touched on some things I was going to say. Yeah, in fact, I think it would be very interesting if somehow can collaborate with this research. But I was now, because Flavio sort of said everything I was going to also say, but I have a question. It's related to the THI, and as you finished your presentation talking about the thermal indicator we have that we use, and the THI as it has some advantages and disadvantages. So I was wondering, first, I think the question that I sometimes I come across is about the THI, this formula that was an adaptation from, humans, thermal stress, and then since the years 60s or whatever, and we're still using them, or this THI. I noticed that you did some modification with the formula, or actually you compared what the group in the US they did to, instead of using the average temperature, to use the maximum. I also did this in my study based on your work and the results that you achieved. So I was wondering, the question is basically, how is it for you when you think about this threshold, or sorry, the THI, yeah, the thermal indicator? Do you think it's necessary to have a development of a new temperature, humidity indicator for, let's say, a Canadian hosting population or a Canadian dairy cattle? Yeah, that was my question. I hope it was clear.
Thank you, Ivan, for your question, and I also take into account what Flavio just said, and I know it's a lot of your work, and that's a great question. So I feel like we have two choices starting from here. So we can develop a new index, maybe that one that would consider maybe wind speed or stuff like that are not considered into THI, or we can try to work with keep THI but find good threshold. That's what I'm trying. Sorry, I'm not making myself very clear, and I should have said a disclaimer that I just got back from maternity leave and I feel my English is more rusty than ever, so I'm very sorry about that. But I feel like we can keep THI, but at least if we work with adequate or accurate threshold, at least we have something to work with here. So I feel like in the past year we've worked with THI with like you mentioned, it's an equation that dates back from 1959. We don't have much information about this equation, how it was developed. There's not much in the literature. So, sorry, you guys froze. Did you hear me well?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So, and we use that THI of 68 as a proxy, but we cannot use that. So either we come up with a new index, or at least we work with appropriate thresholds. I feel like that's my take on this.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, just a final comment, but what we found here, considering these two provinces, we worked with, we ended up having different thresholds for the production traits. And that goes in line with what you were saying.
for milk yield, you apparently in your first study you did not find any association. We found there was a different relationship when we looked at the graphic, milk yield and temperature humidity index. So that helped us to sort of guided us to get to a different threshold. And that's something interesting because, in fact, if you look at the literature, they usually assume a single threshold for all milk production traits, fat yield, protein yield, and milk yield.
Mm-hmm.
But as we can see, there is some evidence that they are not equally affected, right?
Right.
But yeah, no, thank you very much, Dr. Ouellet.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ivan. We have another question then in the chat from Tiago, who says, thank you for the great presentation. Is there any effort for gene editing to address dairy heat stress as the SLIC gene already reported for beef cattle?
Right, the SLIC gene, we hear about it a lot, especially down in Florida. To my knowledge, I'm not so sure, to be honest. I don't want to say things that I will regret because we're being recorded, but I would have to look more into that. But to my knowledge, maybe, but probably more down in Florida and other places.
Perfect. Lucas?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Very well.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Ouellet. It was a great presentation. I have probably a more basic question because you were talking about milk yield at the beginning and how it's affected by heat stress. And then you showed the fat and protein yields already being affected in different levels, and Ivan was talking about it as well. I was just wondering, is it common in the literature to just use milk yield as the trait being looked at, or do you actually use ECM? Or is there any effort on creating a corrected trait for heat stress somehow, since it affects the three traits in the different level? Wouldn't that be, I don't know, would that make sense?
Yeah, maybe that's something I should have done. In my paper, I presented ECM for sure. But again, with the studies that are conducted in the States, they go directly to milk yield. They don't pay as much attention to milk components. But yeah, that's a great comment.
Because I just thought about it because you said that the cow is spending energy to keep itself a little bit cooler. So that energy is also being directed towards the milk or fat or protein. So maybe
Right.
coming up with a phenotype that addresses all of that. Wouldn't be easy, of course, but yeah. Thank you.
Great comments. And Colin, if you let me, can I just add something about the comment that Ivan the conversation that I was just having with Ivan. For everyone's knowledge, one of my colleagues, Dr. Rico at the CRESAD, which is our research center here in Quebec City, we tried to impose heat stress to some of the cows in our herds, and it was really hard to create that milk yield that we notice in the literature. So even with THI up, I feel they ended up using a THI of 77, 75, I think, to create that decrease in milk yield that is reported in the literature. So it was hard to get those animals to actually reduce their milk yields. So there's something there.
Okay, we have another question then from Yanush. Are there any studies related to heat stress and feed efficiency?
Yes, there are a couple, especially some colleagues in Italy worked on that. It is quite interesting to look at feed efficiency under heat stress. There's so many factors to take in, and also since the animal will reduce his feed intake and reduce rumination times, sometimes we see that the digesta will move on slower into the digestive tract. So sometimes we see a better use of the nutrients under in stress, but this is really there are different studies and different conclusion in the literature.
Okay, perfect. Do we have any? Flavio?
Yes, I just have a comment. And see, Veronique, you experience the same with your data. We note that in case of milk yield, the threshold is much later, like much higher, when you see the decrease in milk yield. But before the milk yield to decrease, the milk yield increases with THI. And that was a puzzle when we look at this, right? Say, wow, the animal here is already starting some heat stress and is increasing production or decrease, and then later on start to decrease. And the answer was simple when we talked to people, physiologists, is because the cow is drinking water, more water to compensate. So it's producing more milk, but fluids, not solids. So there is that phase that you increase the milk production, then later on with higher THI, you see the decrease. When it's not, there is no more way for the cow to drink more water, it doesn't help. So it doesn't produce more milk. So, did you notice this in your data?
We noticed that, and also one hypothesis that we had is that in our heat stress condition, the cow will have time to relieve its heat load during the night, right? So we have sometimes the heat stress doesn't last all day, but then the cow can dissipate more heat during the night and will tend to eat more also at night. So we do see that decrease in dry matter intake during the day, but we also think that maybe the cow will compensate at night. So adding with that, drinking water and consuming nutrients. Yeah.
Okay. Just a comment. It's a complex, and that's depend on the management too, right? I heard from producers that say that the heat, how hot is the night is key, because hot nights is much worse than during the day, because the cows cannot alleviate this during the night. So
yeah,
that's observation from the producer that comment to me.
But you're right. It's a big puzzle, and today I only touched the production, the performance, but there's also reproduction that comes at play, and I didn't really talk about that. But that's another topic completely. So.
Okay. Thanks again, Renee.
Thank you.
Thanks, Flavio. Do we have any last questions then for Dr. Ouellet? I'm not seeing any. So once again, I'd just like to thank you again, Dr. Ouellet, for the great presentation, and thank you everyone for the great discussion as well after the presentation. Next week, there's no CGIL seminar, but we'll see you all in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you for having me. Have a great day, everyone. Have a nice weekend.
You too.